Hey, good evening. Welcome to the Privy Council. We are back after a short interlude of being away. And we have a special guest this evening. We said we were going to spin the globe and talk about hotspots in the world, and we're going to do that a little bit later. But we had the opportunity to ask Chad Nagel to join us. And Chad is an attorney. I'll let Chad explain Chad's interest in other, but he is the son of Chet Nagel, who many of you will remember was on the show several weeks back. And he's been spending a lot of time in Ukraine, wrote a piece that we all liked and saw on the American Conservative website, and I'll let him explain that. But otherwise, this evening we've got NC Scout reporting in from the wilds of, can I say where you are without fear? Okay, he's in Wyoming, and I'll let him tell you what he's doing there. Um, Queen Victoria is here, subbing for Lindsey Graham, and and Joe Dolio is in a parking lot somewhere in Greater Detroit. Watcher, as always, is trying to keep us between the white lines. A difficult task on the best of days, and it may get even more difficult today. But Chad, I'm going to turn this over to you and let you sort of give us a little bit of your background, and we'll go from there.
Okay, well, thanks, Dan. As you mentioned, I did publish an article on Monday about Ukraine, and I included some of my experiences there. I visited there last year. It was September, and I mentioned in the article that I mentioned the most sort of prominent natural and historical border dividing Ukraine into two halves, which is the main river, the Dnieper River, and then the next day after I published it, the Kakhovka dam broke. It collapsed, and this is going to be a huge humanitarian catastrophe. They've already evacuated tens of thousands. They'll probably have to evacuate hundreds of thousands of people. It looks, although I was reluctant to believe it at first, but it does look as if the Russians did actually do this. I never believed that they did the Nord Stream, but so it makes it look a bit like revenge. But I don't know, obviously. But it looks like it could have been them. And so what they've done, really, or whoever did it, is to make that natural border much wider, at least in that area, and that is the main sort of frontier between the Ukrainian and Russian forces that were facing off in preparation for this, much anticipated spring counteroffensive. We're fast running out of spring, so people were wondering whether it was ever going to happen. And this may have forestalled that, and it may be that the sort of the demands of the humanitarian crisis just essentially bring out of necessity the conflict to, if not a halt, a serious slowdown. But I'm not a military expert, and in fact, I don't have any military background in my bio. A brief period in a military high school, but I'd rather not talk about it. But I don't know what the military situation really is going to be. But my guess is that the Russians have just, in one fell swoop, created a massive swamp. And if the Ukrainians want to advance over a mosquito-infested and also trash-strewn and other waste-strewn swamp to confront the Russian forces, that's going to be pretty daunting. So, this was sort of an unfortunately and negatively, it was negative in terms of the human consequences, timed article. But I, unlike some here, I have not yet published a book. And when I came back from Saudi Arabia at the end of 2020, so the lockdowns were still in place and the whole vaccine rollout was starting and all that. So it was still in the middle of the pandemic. I hunkered down, and then in 2022, in February, when the full-scale invasion started of Ukraine, I sort of resurrected a project based on personal diaries that I had kept from many years ago of my time in Ukraine. I used to live there, and I traveled around there a lot. And I started writing intensely to compose a book. And it's just since then, of course, it's just from one catastrophe to another. And I would really like to get back out there somehow once maybe the threat of cholera and dengue fever has subsided, and set myself up in a place like Odessa and finish this book. So that's really what I've done. And before, as I said, I came back from Saudi Arabia, and I think the last time that I appeared in this kind of conversation format, we talked about it a bit. I had some experience with serious flooding in dealing with Yemen, because that was my function there. It was an agency dealing with that humanitarian crisis. And at the time the bombing was going on, and there were lots of floods because Yemen has regular cyclones that batter the coast. Mm-hmm. They happen probably at least a couple of times a year with very serious flooding. So the Saudis got involved in that whole thing. They, not to be left out, they wanted to have a good face and show that they were there vacuuming up all the wastewater as well to prevent the spread of dengue fever and other disease, because they already had a cholera problem down there. And I don't know that much about what's happening, obviously, right now in Kherson, in the southern part of Ukraine that's flooded. But it looks, in terms of the scale of it, potentially much, much worse than the average flood in Yemen, which is bad enough, but for different reasons. I don't know how long it's going to take for all the water to flood into the Black Sea, but it's going to be pretty awful, I should think, in the next, weeks or months. And
my understanding is that they think that 10 to 15 days is the peak of the flooding in this iteration, and at which point things will have subsided to a new normal. Not the old normal, but a new normal. And it'll still be messy. It'll still be difficult. It'll still be muddy, and we'll see how that progresses. I think the other thing is that we were talking earlier today, about the fact that Zaporizhzhia is down to one active reactor, and they've got adequate water to cool that. They don't expect any real issues. Once the new normal has been established, it'll be several feet above the minimum level where they can draw water to cool that reactor. So yeah, it will be interesting to see. I think that'll be the least of the problems that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And actually, I mean, I don't know a great deal about reactors, but that was one of the things as I was scurrying in my steep learning curve to figure out what the consequences would be. But apparently the nuclear reactor is not the main concern, because, as you say, there is enough water to cool the single reactor that's functioning. But if I understand it correctly, the water level north of the dam will drop as well, and all the sort of towns and villages that depend on the river for water are going to be affected. I don't know what the scale will be, but will be a lot of displacement, and maybe things will settle down within the next couple of weeks. But I know from being in the former Soviet Union in summer, I don't recommend it. I don't recommend it at all. I mean, it doesn't matter where you are. I mean, you could be in Siberia, which is a classically cold place, and the mosquito situation is very, very serious. And I don't know. I mean, I know that dengue fever was a serious problem, and malaria, in fact, I think in Yemen during the really bad time when the bombing was constant, more or less, and the fighting was constant. I don't know what the Ukrainians are going to be able to do, but I think it's sort of a swamp down there. And I don't know. I mean, it looks pretty grim, but I mean, it does now seem as if the Russians pulled a kind of Stalin 1941 thing, where they just figured, okay, we can prevent them from crossing the river by blowing the dam. And I'm not an engineer, so I don't. I mean, I saw the satellite images that were put online of the first water flowing through on June 1st. And if that represented the blowing of the dam with explosives, then it means that it was only 5 days later that the dam itself actually collapsed. And some people are saying, well, it was so thick and it's so heavy that, yeah, it did take that long. I have no idea, but it does seem very strange. And nobody sent up an alarm after June 1st, when presumably those images, which BBC and others put online, it feels very sudden to the average member of the public.
Well, it sounds to me like they've taken the plot from Force 10 of Navarone, right? Where they put they put those tiny little explosives in the bottom of that dam, and everybody's berating the poor British demolition guy, and he said, "Wait, just wait." And finally, nature and gravity took its course. But
but Stan, the English aren't involved in Ukraine.
Yeah,
no, I know. There's no SAS folks anywhere near Ukraine. They're still cleaning up Nord Stream.
So I have a question as kind of not being a Russia/Soviet guy. Is the river a kind of natural barrier between what would be Russian influence and non-Russian influence?
I mean, historically it is, but we're talking pretty ancient history. I mean, look, Putin has always said that Ukraine is not a real country. And by that, and he always reminding us, and by that he means, it was never independent before the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the borders that are internationally recognized don't represent anything except for what he says is, Lenin's, vision and so forth. And that's
augmented by Khrushchev's opportunism.
Well, yeah, but the addition of Crimea in 1954 to Ukraine, which was purely because I think the Soviets couldn't be bothered to build a bridge, which Putin ultimately did in pretty record speed before the Ukrainians bombed it. It's definitely a mess. But I mean, Putin is not everything he says is wrong. I mean, he's right. It wasn't ever internationally recognized. And if you go back, I mean, you can't really find much history of Ukrainian independence. They never managed to. And Ukrainian is not it's not really an ethnicity. It's more like a mishmash. It's more like a melting pot, if you like.
It's more like being European.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, when I've been there, I mean, the people that I've met, and they, you meet people. I used to meet people who were citizens of Ukraine, but would speak in terms of their nationality. And one guy would say, "Yeah, I'm Ukrainian." Another guy said, "No, I'm Russian." He was a Ukrainian citizen, but he considers himself Russian. I couldn't figure out for the life of me, except that what they meant, except that the guy who considered himself Ukrainian drew on other aspects of his lineage, perhaps his education when he went to a Ukrainian language school instead of a Russian language school, something like that. But definitely not. It's more of a kind of self identity. I couldn't really, I never really got it. It's lots of Polish and Jewish and other, and there's some stuff in the West, the Ruthenians, the Galicians and stuff.
Right.
The more east you go, I'm sorry. I mean, everyone I ever made friends with in Kiev, they were Russian speakers. They only spoke Russian. Some didn't even know how to speak Ukrainian. And they'd always say, well, that, I can understand it, but they would never speak it. And then you go further and further east. And my experience with them was, by the time you got to about 10 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, they were already saying, we don't give a damn what those people in the East, meaning their fellow, Ukrainian citizens in the Donbass, we don't give a damn what they do. Give them a liter of vodka and a kilo of sausage, and they're happy, and they can go wherever they want. We don't want anything to do with them. So I had a sense very early on that it was sort of two countries in one. And I worked out there as a kind of election monitor for several years, and I monitored several polls in Ukraine, the presidential election, parliamentary election, and a referendum. And it was always the same picture. The post-election map was always the same. And those areas that are controlled by Russia now, they always were the same color. I mean, it's just, and you can say, well, that's all because it's falsified, it's all the fraud. But it's clearly not. I mean, you went out there, you talked to locals, you asked them about their opinions. They weren't speaking under duress. They weren't speaking. It wasn't voter suppression. There might have been some fraud, but I didn't feel there was any coercion. So I always had the sense that it was two countries in one. And so now we had this uncomfortable situation of a de facto partition or division. And the question is, how sustainable is it? And history has not shown that it's been very sustainable. It's been partitioned before in history, in ancient history, you know, when Poland was a great European power, and we're talking a long time ago. And, you know, it lasted for however long it lasted, and then sure enough, it collapsed. I mean,
Well, Poland itself, if you read Minchner's book on Poland, it's a pretty good summary. Poland itself has been amoeba-like in the context of its shape and form and ethnicity and so forth. And Ukraine is not much different from a geographic perspective. I think it's useful, and I have not done this before with you, but I think it's useful for me to give you my understanding, my view on this war, so that you understand it. And that is, I have said since 2014 that this is a Slavic civil war, and that's exactly, in my view, what it is, and it's what it remains. Now, everybody sort of, you know, picked up sides on either side of that, but it is a Slavic civil war, and it's one that in 2014 was largely, again, my opinion, was largely fomented by the Obama administration in the follow-on to the Maidan revolution with the color revolution in 2014, as they shoved Yanukovych on an airplane to get him out of there. So I don't have a lot of truck for all of the manifestations of Ukrainian nationalism, because what I hear you saying is you're not sure it exists. I don't believe it exists either, and I've spent a fair amount of time in the Ukraine. So yeah. I think we're pretty much on the same page from that perspective. Yeah. I'm going to stop for 1 minute. I have some housekeeping items I need to do for members of the chat. This is my first official opportunity to say Mazel Tov to Auntie Kami and Valerie Nelson on the birth of their daughter in the last couple of days. So to you guys, job well done. I hope everybody's safe and doing well and home from the hospital by now. If not, we'll be soon. So congratulations, you guys. We're very, very happy for you at this particular point, even though I know Auntie Kami was complaining about his back, to which my comment was he was in design, she was in production. So I don't want to hear anything about sore backs from the design component of the production team. So and to as far as Sweden's claim to Ukraine, I will just remind you there's a little place called Poltava, and that sort of put paid to Sweden's claim in the Ukraine chat. So let's move on from there. So tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write this piece in American Conservative, because it is, I think it's fair to say, and I'm not criticizing you for it. I'm actually praising you, because I think it dares to ask some questions, and it makes some statements that you will hear around here quite a bit. And that is, I think we've got some fundamental decisions to make about what comes next in the Ukraine. I don't think that the current situation is sustainable from the U.S.'s perspective and from the Zelenskyy government's perspective, particularly now if the spring offensive becomes a fall offensive in that context. So tell us a little bit about what you saw and and Watcher, if I could ask you to put a link in the chat for this piece so that people can pull it up and follow along if they're so interested.
Sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, my view has been from very early on that an open-ended commitment without any kind of clear end game or strategic objective on the part of the United States is a mistake, anywhere. I mean, early on when this whole thing started, very early, after the full-scale invasion in February, there was some kind of, vague pronouncement by the United States that we had to help the Ukrainians to defend themselves. So this was a humanitarian thing. And it wasn't very long after that the Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, made a statement publicly. I think it was when he went sort of, in a covert mission to Ukraine through Poland with Blinken, but I can't remember exactly. But it was, it was a few months later, and he said, "No, our objective is to degrade the Russians' ability to weaken Russia. I think
Mhm.
he actually used those terms, and that was very, I think, unwise. I mean, even if that is what they're trying to do, to say that just seems to me to be very, very impolitic. I mean, that is just not diplomatic. And if I'm not mistaken, he and Blinken both got, dressed down by Biden when they came back. That's what was widely rumored, that they spoke,
They said the quiet part out loud. Yeah.
right, exactly. And, and it was clear that at that point that, okay, well, this isn't what the main objective of this war is. It's not to save lives. It's to somehow, grind down the Russian, warfighting capability. So, I mean, I became jaded on this whole thing quite early. I mean, I don't, there is still a sort of strain that portrays Putin as a great statesman. I haven't been there since like 1999, or like when he was first on the rise, and maybe because I remember
from the very beginning, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the very beginning, because I remember that he became prime minister, and he immediately went down to Chechnya, and he immediately went down to the front line and greeted his own troops and showed kind of support. And I thought, well, this is what the Russians should have been doing all along. But I mean, I became very jaded on him pretty early on. I mean, I have my own theories about him. I don't, I'm not a believer that he's a great statesman. And I think that, as I said in the article, I think waiting 8 years to launch a full-scale invasion while a very large-scale military buildup is going on under your nose makes very little sense to me. I don't know why it took that long, but it was clearly bound to result in more casualties. And depending on who you listen to, and I don't know what to believe about the casualties. I don't know what to believe. Depending on which side you listen to, either way, the number of casualties in this war after, 15 months, is more than the combined losses of the Soviet Union in their entire time in Afghanistan, plus the United States in the whole of Vietnam. And so that, and to me, that really boggles the mind. And this is a major, meat grinder. It is, as RFK Jr. says, an abattoir. And what is our justification for it? And we don't have an end game. People are dying. And so, my article was sort of written as a way of trying to. I mean, I'm not a big believer in swift solutions, but it's some kind of vision that sees an end to it. Because if it goes on and on, I mean, I just can't imagine it. I think the Russians, the Putin government leadership, I think they at least look at a map. I mean, they're at least cognizant of what their borders look like, what the coast looks like, what they need to defend, what they need to prevent. I don't know that the Ukrainians, the actual people who claim to be this Ukrainian pro-Western government, I don't know that they ever look at maps at all. I mean, I've had conversations with some of them about things like Odessa, the Black Sea coast, and they're like, oh, no, it's really well defended, but they don't think about it very much. The whole coastline is blockaded, and the Russians did that very early on. And if you think about it, we've been putting down Erdogan, who we used to love. 20 years ago, he was great. We were very enthusiastic about Mr. Erdogan in Turkey because he was the conservative Democratic Party, and we were going to reward him with membership in the European Union, and he would join the European People's Party group, which is with the Christian Democrats and all that.
Right.
They were going to be, and their reward was going to be accession to the EU. Well, that's all dead now. They're not going to get into if they do get into the EU, it'll be because the EU is totally melted down. And so now, now that we've turned totally against him and supporting his opposition, and he controls the Straits, if you wanted to somehow, I don't know, threaten the Russian blockade from the other side, you couldn't do it. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what sort of relationship they have, but I don't think Erdogan sees any incentive to do that. I don't think why would he? I mean, he hasn't gotten anything out of it. And they're anxious to get on with trade with Russia. I think the Turks, I mean, they're not, they're not going to, we've really sort of shot ourselves in the foot in this. And
I think the general consensus amongst panel members here is that our economic warfare relative to this conflict has been counterproductive for our own interests and for the European interests, that the sanctions and the financial constraints and everything that we've done has really sort of been more impetus to push the rest of the world together in opposition of what Lavrov and Putin sort of jokingly called the rules-based order in the world, and have been an incentive for new trade relationships to spin up and new currencies to be used for things that the dollar used to be used for. And I think we've been on the net negative in terms of what's been achieved by many of the sanctions and other actions that we've taken. And that's notwithstanding any of the military aid and humanitarian aid that we've given Ukraine. I did see that Zelenskyy was upset today, really upset today, about the lack of flood-related aid that was coming forth from the donor communities around the world. And I think that's a really good example of not having any real self-awareness.
No, I think
Because I don't think there's any money left to shovel towards Ukraine at this particular point.
yeah, I mean, it's usually
I
costly.
I know that we as the U.S. government just got our credit card back, and we're going to go sell $1 trillion worth of Treasury securities in the next 10 days to try to put us back on path. But I think it says a lot that Zelenskyy actually came out and said he was disappointed in the lack of flood-related assistance. I mean, FEMA doesn't move that fast. The Europeans don't move that fast. But it does show a sort of set of expectations on Zelensky's part that if he's got a hangnails, we need to chopper in, nurses or whatever. So I think the longer this goes,
why would we need to chopper in nurses? Is somebody in need of TikTok dances?
Maybe. I think the longer this goes, the more people are going to be seeing Zelenskyy for who and what he really is, and I think that's useful in some ways.
Yeah, and it has to be remembered. I mean, Zelenskyy, I can't remember how old he is now, but when he came in to office, I mean, this was a young guy. He was almost a punk, in my opinion. I mean, he was early 40s or whatever. Maybe that's not a punk, but he was voted. It was a massive protest vote. It was a massive protest vote against his predecessor, who lost by the biggest margin in post-Soviet Ukrainian history of any president. I mean, this guy got like 23% of the vote, I think, or something, or less. I don't know. But anyway, Zelenskyy got 73% of the vote. I mean, it's obscene. It's unheard of. You look at the election map for the Zelenskyy election, and every single oblast, which is the district, the districts that it's subdivided into, except for one, which was Lviv, which is the furthest west on the border with Poland. And that's where, Stepan Bandera and these others came from. That was the only one that went for Poroshenko in the entire country. Now, and Zelenskyy ran on a peace platform. So he ran as the guy that was going to bring peace, and he wanted to. I'm sure he did. And he probably intended to. And he had some opportunities to breach a ceasefire and to sue for peace during this. And we stopped him. I mean, unfortunately, it was the UK that kind of stepped in mostly and said, no, you don't want to do that. And we did as well. So, of course, they do whatever they're told. I mean, as you said, he's now angry that we haven't given him all this flood aid. Well, he's spoiled now. I mean, he's been given everything he wanted. And I mean, I don't want to put him down as the worst leader there is. I don't actually think he is a leader at all, because I don't think he was put in for that reason. And I don't think he had any idea of what it meant. And I don't think he's running the show now. He's just the most visible figure. As soon as he declared martial law, and that's the interesting thing, martial law in Ukraine, which was declared after the invasion early last year. In most countries, that means that the military takes over as the government, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, I just remember martial law in Poland. It was General Jaruzelski, and those guys that were in power before, they were shunted aside. So if you're a president, you're a civilian, and you're elected, and then you declare martial law, I mean, are you saying that the military is now actually in charge, but hey, I'm still here as a mascot? And that's what actually I think happened. And worse than that, if their military may be in charge, But, to what extent is their indigenous military in charge? They made a big deal out of this one military commander, Zelenskyy, who was supposed to be this great hero because they need heroes. But I have no idea the extent to which they're actually running the show. And I have
Well,
my
I think they've been very careful not to elevate anybody to within spitting distance of being on par with Zelenskyy, because Zelenskyy has been very effective at what he's done, and that he's taken the tin cup and he's rattled it at everybody, and he's got to give him his due. He's been successful at it. He's made the case that the West needs to step up and support um, a free and democratic Ukraine. I couldn't almost get that out of my mouth, but that we're obligated to do this. And oh, by the way, we get to grind the Russians into dust as well. I think both those are false on their face, but he's been effective at selling that message, and they don't want anybody to compete with him. So everybody else is a minion in the background, and there is no, Field Marshal Zhukov or anybody else to point to that is a hero of the Ukraine, because that's Zelensky's sole call at this particular point. So I think that's going to bite him, because I think he's in a tough spot. I don't think he's got, and I'm interested not just in your view but other people's view on this panel. I don't think the Ukraine's got the manpower to execute an effective offensive. That was before this dam broke, and I'm probably more convinced of that after the disaster with this dam. I don't think that they've got the number of troops necessary to pursue and prosecute an offensive of the magnitude that they've been talking about for months. Matt, what do you think?
No, I concur. It's not even manpower.
By the way, I see the sun has gone down in where you are.
No, actually, it started raining.
Okay.
And the wind was blowing the rain across the front porch. So
Okay.
that was the only covered place to be outdoors. So I had to bring it inside in
Got
the
it.
bunkhouse.
Okay.
But they do not have the manpower. They've soaked up a lot of losses already. I mean, that's an established fact. Here's the thing: the German armor that's been put forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
As I never worked with armor. Yeah, I was light infantry, long range surveillance, long range reconnaissance. But I do know some things about the train up time on that, and I know what it takes to keep those crews proficient. The amount of training time they've had has been minimal at best. The discussions have been they're fielding multiple types of Western armor, from German to British to American. So there's no consistent supply line at that point.
Mm-hmm.
What we're about to see, and it's very interesting to me that there are so many pundits out there that get this fact wrong when they should know better, that this is all a recipe for disaster, and what this is going to lead to is an absolute destruction of a lot of the surplus arms that we had. So that very same strategy that Chad, you were discussing, that came out of the State Department, you were exactly right when you pointed out they Stan, that they said the quiet part out loud, that we're trying to sap the Russian materiel, we're trying to sap their ability to make war. Okay, well, if you're doing that, then you have to assume that the same strategy is going to be used against you, and we know that there's a substantial amount of evidence that supports that. Why are they not asking for more javelins, for example? Because there are no more to give them. This is a simple fact. There are no more to give them. We have a 7-year turnaround time to resupply our own stockpile. This is a fact. Okay, this is not disputable. And
so who's been bled white by this is what you're saying, right?
Right, exactly. And so why is that? So because they bled away that stockpile, Russia's supply line of anti-tank guided missiles, right? ATGMs, they still have a strong stockpile of them, and their resupply line is very short. Now, from the Russian side, we've seen their failings. That much is indisputable. But at the same time, they are very well entrenched where they are. They, at least at my level, analyzing this from what I know in my professional education and experience, I don't see how there's going to be any sort of counteroffensive without an incredible amount of loss of life. It's not going to be successful, and I think at this juncture, and something that you said early on when I was starting to get rained on and I had to shuffle back indoors, but it was a critical point, was that there is also a cultural dichotomy that exists inside of Ukraine. That's going to be a problem as well. And I think that that's going to begin to rear its head more and more. Um, Looking at some of the Russian outlets that have come out of this dam breaking and the flood, the second order effects out of that, and what the third order effects are going to be. There was some footage with no context that I saw, so I can't really comment on, obviously exactly what was going on. But it looked like to me that at least the civilians that were affected in the area were being helped out by the Russian soldiers. And we can't necessarily say the same from the Ukrainian side. I would assume that inside of their own areas of control, that they would be doing that, because civilian aid is obviously a critical factor on the battlefield. But we don't know.
I just, Matt, just so you know, you may not have seen it because you've been busy out there, but
Yeah.
Zelensky's magnanimous attitude knows no bounds. He was chastising the Russians on Twitter today about the abandoned pets that have been dislocated by this flood. Okay, so the call went out for Sarah McLachlan, or whoever that woman is that gets on television and talks to you about dogs and cats and all the rest of that sort of stuff. So I'm sure that if Zelensky's got time for abandoned cats and dogs, he's doing the same for the Ukrainian people, whom he loves. Right? I'm being sarcastic, but it's a little rich, in my opinion.
Where I'm going with this is that we've seen substantial evidence of, I won't tap dance around it, the Azov battalion. These are the bully boys. These are the guys who are getting out there and beating people up in the streets. We've seen this. This is the internal enforcement arm of the political objectives coming out of the Zelensky regime, right? This is what we would call fascism if it was anyone else.
Yeah, it's the brown shirts. Yeah.
Exactly. That's exactly what this is. And so, looking back at history and understanding that there is a cultural dichotomy, there's at least some segment of the population that maybe is looking at that like, this really isn't that acceptable. And they're beating up people who they are attempting to conscript into their military. And we know historically as well, conscripts don't fight very well, right? All your motivated troops already enlisted. They're the ones that already went to the front. They're the ones that probably already mostly died, right? So this, where I'm going with all of this, is the fact that this is a zero-sum game at this point. That the strategy that our State Department, our Department of Defense, what have you, is putting forth, the commentary on that. Oh, well, we're going to sap the Russian strength, sap the Russian this. We're going to say, well, we really need to look in the mirror. We're doing the same, and we don't have the economy here at home to be able to support this indefinitely. I think we're on borrowed time ourselves. One last thing, and then I'll turn it back to everybody else. There was one story that I did see today that is significant both to the Taiwanese theater that is brooding and the Ukrainian theater of operations. And that is that Lloyd Austin was in India to celebrate the building of a new GE plant for rocket engines. Well,
no, for jet engines.
Jet engines, correct. You're right. I was reading it in passing in an airport, so it cut me a little bit of slack.
Yeah, Jim and I have talked about that at length today. Go ahead.
Mhm. So this is an extremely significant move. We could say that this is pre-positioning assets on the potential battlefield, pre-positioning logistics, but we also have to recognize that while China and India, and this is something I've talked about in the past, in episodes in the past, while China and India have a strong point of contention with one another at the moment, Russia and India, on the other hand, are partners and see each other as favorable trading partners. We're positioning things that we should be building domestically that we can easily export. We're now building them with potential, with the potential that the Russians are going to be watching and have, in some cases, direct hands on this advanced technology that we're going to be building in these factories. This is not painting a strong picture to me.
Matt, it goes beyond that. I'm going to cut to I'm going to cut to the chase. This is us selling the seed corn for short-term gain. We have no business providing jet engine, military fighter engine technology to the Indians on a joint venture basis. What that says to the rest of the world is that we've learned nothing from 30 years of engagement with the Chinese, where we threw the doors to the IP warehouse open and said, what do you want? In order to get a foothold in China. And now our politicians do nothing but complain about the fact that the Chinese have stolen every bit of IP that's ever been involved in a joint venture with any Western country. There's no sainthood for Indians as it relates to that same sort of motivation. And the fact that we're going to build these GE engines, which are used for fighter jets in India, you can bet that the Russians will have access to it one way or the other. You can bet that the Chinese will later have access to the IP and the technology one way or the other. If you've done business in India or any place else in the emerging markets, you know that that's a fact. But for short-term gain, and because we have nothing else to use as leverage to try to maintain U.S. relevance and hegemony in that part of the world, we're going to sell the seed corn to the Indians. We're going to be glad to take it, but we're not going to win any favors. And the Germans are doing the same thing now, selling German submarines to the Indians. They announced that 2 days ago with the integration of Indian weapons on board. So the West, as in general, in my estimation, is pawning all the heirlooms to try to continue to throw money into the war in Ukraine.
Yep.
That's my view. So, Jim, anything on that? And then we'll get back to, because I want to get back to Chad's article because it makes a very cogent point, which I'll let him explain about the binary nature of our decision in Ukraine. But anything else on that stuff, Jim, before we go back to Chad?
Yeah, just the situation vis-a-vis the GE agreements in India and the German agreements in India, it's just one of those things that pops up every decade or so where you see publicly traded companies, their professional executive and governance class feels obligated to monetize core intellectual property subsidized by taxpayer money in order to maintain their profitability and their bonus structure. And I've seen it probably in 3 cycles vis-a-vis China. I watched GE sell a lot of their assets into China when they thought they were going to become a banking company. So here you have another cycle of American defense contractors and key technology providers offloading technology that's fundamental to our competitive advantage. And it will be for a 12 to 24 month cash bump. And guys like Sullivan and the other folks in the White House who are probably behind this because it's kind of their baby. They'll be saying, oh, it's just computing technology and bits and pieces. The key is when you sell bits and pieces to people, they begin
But it's also
to
metallurgy.
things.
It's also metallurgy. And that's the key piece.
Yeah, materials and metallurgy is huge in this engine game. So I watched this be withheld more than a decade ago, 20 years ago. And it was the smartest thing we ever did. And now all of a sudden I see it back on the table. And it's just a bad idea.
The
honestly.
poster child for why this is a bad idea is an example almost 30 years ago, when we sold design and metallurgy technology to Toshiba. Now, this is a Japanese company, okay?
Yep.
For the design of propellers on our nuclear submarines, which within 8 months ended up in Moscow. And everybody had that shock face as a result of that. And that's why there's been sort of a pall on this stuff for a long period of time, but we've forgotten that lesson as well. And, Toshiba, the CEO Toshiba came out and he cried and he bowed and he did all the stuff he had to do. But it's never been forgotten by some of us that Toshiba was a bunch of rat fuckers who sold us out to the Soviets at that particular time. My words. Okay. And so, we'll leave that there. So let's get back to Partition for Peace, and Chad, I'll ask you to sort of lay out your what I took away as your primary premise, which is that we need to make a decision, and we need to make a decision soon as to what we're going to do vis-a-vis Ukraine, and the impact that has on what we're going to do vis-a-vis my big bugaboo. What are we going to do about NATO? And I'll let you take it from there.
Well, thank you, Stan. That is central really to the piece, even if it doesn't seem like it, which is whether NATO is, and the continued funding and support of NATO is something that is of vital national security interest to the United States. And when I talk about it with other people, they always bring up some counterpoint. It's like, well, what about, this and this, and, even ridiculous things like the opportunity to test new weapon systems. They actually argue this stuff. And you always come back and say, no, the question was vital national security interest. Somebody brought up an NFL analogy. They said, well, you always try to get into the playoffs so that you can get to the Super Bowl and win it, meaning basically Russian regime change and mastery of the entire world. That's, well, okay. I accept the NFL analogy, but again, the vital part. Is it vital to our national security here in the United States where we live? Is this something we should be doing? So NATO is one thing. And as I said, the subheading, which was chosen by the editor, was either we're stuck in NATO and Ukraine, or we're stuck into neither. And that is a point that I wanted to make, which is that, NATO may actually be moribund in many ways, but it may also be endangering. In other words, we have these eastern flank countries, Poland and the Baltics.
We call them the Baltic dwarves.
Baltic dwarves, yes. If you think about it, these are former Soviet republics that all together, their populations are probably less than the size of, Philadelphia. I don't know. But it's a small group of people. Now, I will say that when I went over in August and September, and I just decided, look, I haven't been to these places in a long time. I want to see how they've fared since, in the last, what is it like there? Is it still a dump? Because it definitely was when I was there. And believe it or not, I was favorably impressed. Although the one that I was most favorably impressed with of the three dwarfs by far was Latvia. And I drove north from Poland and I drove through a city called Daugavpils, which is close to the border with Belarus and is small. It's only about 80,000 people. And then the first is Riga, which is the biggest of the Baltic capitals. And by the way, Riga is an absolutely stunning city. If you ever get a chance to go, it is beautiful. The architecture is unique. It's like some kind of Hanseatic, I don't know, very Protestant. It's much more impressive than either Vilnius or Tallinn by far. It's an amazing looking place. But anyway, Daugavpils.
It's the residue of the Teutonic Knights, if you know.
It is. And so is Gdansk, by the way, which is Poland. But anyway, Daugavpils, I made time to visit a Russian cultural center there, and they were having a party for a holiday, and it was a Russian holiday. I can't remember what it was, but it had to do with the harvest, and it was something agricultural. But it was dancers, and they were doing. It was amazing. I took some film and some footage, and I just got a very nice sense of that place. And it was reasonably well put together. The roads were good. Lithuania, not so much. Bad roads, but overall not bad. My overall impression of these three countries was they were actually quite pleasant, much, much nicer than Ukraine. And Poland is okay. I mean, I was staying in Krakow, and I thought it was quite a nice city. I mean, people are very nice, and there were these tremendous volunteer efforts. And I just thought, well, look, I mean, we've got these countries that are small countries, and they're on the eastern flank, and they're very keen, and they pay their dues. And now we're stuck in this thing because the Germans, they would have gone along with Moscow, and the French probably too, and the Italians. They would have gone along probably with the business opportunities that Moscow represented. And the Berlin-Moscow axis, I mean, forget about the Second World War. I mean, it's a business axis. I mean, they are very, very into each other. And Putin is a Germanophile, no question about it. But in between them are these little countries. And we now have a security commitment. We now have a collective security agreement with these countries. And we have to decide, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to continue and lose face, or are we not? I don't think it's a set deal. I don't think NATO necessarily is an inevitability. I think the Brits are much more keen, and I think that they are offended by these poisoning murders that have happened, which I do think are attributable to Russia, even if Putin himself didn't order them. I don't know that for sure at all.
You mean the Novichok umbrellas? Yeah.
And then the Litvinenko poisoning, which happened, much longer ago. I mean, these things.
Well, Litvinenko was a message. It was not to be missed. Okay?
Well, and also, yeah, right. And also, it has to be said, and this is a creepy thing, but it's not necessarily a huge threat, that the Russians, they kill their own people on foreign territory. They don't really go after us, so there have been people that have been murdered in Washington, and it's been very suspect, and they were Russians or they were former Soviets, people perceived as somehow turncoats. I mean, even what's his name, Yushchenko, back in 2004, and he was poisoned. At first, I couldn't believe it. This was the first high profile instance. And over time, I've had to accept that, yeah, he was poisoned by some kind of deep Russian, ex-Soviet deep state thing. I don't know what happened, but it certainly.
You have to recall that it was Berezovsky who managed to hang himself all by himself.
Exactly, and that's another. Yeah,
in his big house in London. So I mean,
yeah. But I mean, going back to NATO, I mean, the Brits watch this, and the Brits are closer. They're not the closest. They're not nearly as close as the Germans. But they watch all this, and they're anxious, to keep us involved. It's sending Boris Johnson over here and pumping up the reluctant American conservatives to come on. You got to stay with it. And what do we feel we're really getting out of it? I mean, the democracy thing is not. It only goes so far. And one thing that I wanted to make a point of in this article, which I couldn't because there was a word limit and I had to leave it out. But Ukrainian nationalism, which is, in my opinion, an ugly, it's just not pretty. It just isn't. I mean, I have looked for models in Ukraine's history that I thought were benign models for Ukrainian national identity.
It all comes back to Bandera.
It comes back to Bandera. And the thing is, I mean, like I tried to raise the point of there was a very brief absolute monarchy in 1918. And it lasted for 6 or 7 months. And it was actually, I mean, you may not be able, we're Americans, we don't believe in absolute monarchy, but this was back then. And it was actually, yeah, I mean, I personally, I have kind of monarchist reflexes, but I don't think there's ever going to be a king of the world. But the point is, this was an attempt to create a kind of tradition. And the fellow who was the monarch he wasn't anti-Russian. He was anti-Bolshevik, and he essentially was perfectly prepared to be.
So he was a White Russian, basically.
He basically, I mean, he was a former Tsarist general. He'd fought in the Russo-Japanese War. He was very talented, and he came, and he was a nobleman. He was a descendant of one of these hetmans, from going way back, from centuries back. So it was a nice idea. But of course, he allied with the Central Powers in World War I. And when they fell, he fell. So that was a problem. But it wasn't a bad idea. But the Ukrainians today, the nationalists, I mean, they have absolutely no regard for him. And in fact, many of them disparage him because, he was Russophile or whatever. But the problem, of course, as I'm sure you know, with the mascots of Ukrainian nationalism now, prime among whom is Stepan Bandera, is that they basically thought that the Third Reich would guarantee them some kind of Ukrainian free state in exchange for, allying with Nazi Germany during World War II.
And doing some of the dirty bits and some other policy areas.
Oh yeah, and basically, doing the dirty work of the Germans in that area against Poles and Jews and other minorities. And they thought their reward was going to be this Ukrainian free state. And of course, what ended up happening was Bandera and his top guys were arrested, thrown in Sachsenhausen concentration camp for the duration of the war. And then a lot of their followers were executed, and they'd supplied the ranks of the Waffen-SS in the area.
Mm-hmm.
So this was essentially a case of very cruel folly. But somehow that cruel folly has never, it's never sort of sullied the veneer of Bandera himself as a mascot of Ukrainian nationalism. And that is a big, big problem. And the thing is, the Russians will always be able to point to that and say, listen, whatever you think of us, you allied with us, you allied with Stalin against these people.
Right.
You must have made a decision at some point, and now the Ukrainians want you to rewrite history and say, that was a mistake. You should have allied against Stalin. And nobody's ever going to do that, even if it were right. We're not going to go and say, yeah, FDR was, a jerk, and Winston Churchill, they really had it wrong. It's never going to happen. And what it reveals is that when a country is insecure about its national identity and really, really, really is resentful of a sort of an ethnic, I don't know what you'd call it, a cousin, a kin, the Russians and the Ukrainians. I mean, then you retreat into this reaction that is too far, and it becomes, it's cheapened then it becomes, Nazified. And then you don't have a real nationalism, or at least you don't have a benign nationalism. So that is a big problem.
I hate to draw the exact thing because it's not 100%, but boy, kind of feels like Canadians you were talking about there for a minute. Where
that's actually quite good.
Canada, yeah, but Canada's a monarchy. I mean, you cannot, whatever problems Canada has. I mean, I don't think it can be condemned as a totally authoritarian state. I mean, I do.
No. I was just meaning more the nationalism as a result of being a rejection of your
the chip on your shoulder,
neighbors.
chip on your shoulder for your neighbor parallel, I think is quite good.
Actually, the Scots, it was a Scottish author of novels, the guy that writes the detective novels. His name escapes me, but during the whole SNP, Scottish National Party thing, which is now collapsed, he said something like, "We really have become a chippy wee country, haven't we?" And it's the chip on the shoulder. But yeah, I mean, and so that's one of my problems with Ukraine. And it's.
So, what do you think the odds are that this massive, well-advertised offensive never really materializes, or that Zelenskyy is tempted to fulfill his destiny in that regard and his obligations to his patrons by doing something, and that he goes after 1,800 Russian troops in Moldova, in Transnistria, just as a way to take the heat off?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I haven't been to Transnistria in a long time. It's been more than 20 years. And I remember I used to go there because I was with this kind of independent human rights organization that ended up becoming a kind of pariah organization, condemned by the big ones, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, because we reached differing conclusions about elections, like in places like Belarus, and we were convinced that Lukashenko had won legitimately back in 2001 and so forth, and that was unacceptable. But anyway,
that was anti-narrative at that.
That was anti-narrative. Yeah, we were completely. I mean, we were done down in all the, like The Economist and everything.
By the way, well, yes, if you're condemned in The Economist, then you're out.
The badge of honor.
Yeah.
You want to make a T-shirt and
What has happened to Lukashenko? Last I heard, he was in a hospital in Moscow, and Nikolai Lushenko was going to be, appointed the dear leader and subject to a regency for Vladimir Putin. But it's sort of gotten quiet in the last couple of days.
Well, it sounds like you're a lot more up on it than I am. I haven't followed internal Belarus politics for really quite a long time, and I didn't know that about Lukashenko. I'm sure that he feels between a rock and a hard place in this war, and nobody wants to have it forced upon them. But let's face it. I mean, he's been backed into a corner. He's not that old. I think he was only in his 30s. I think he was in his early 30s when he was first elected. But he's been there now almost 30 years because he was first elected in 1994. And I don't know what will happen to Lukashenko, but I do know that there was a provocation on the border with Poland in it was early in 2020. Well, no, it was mid 2021. I think it was in summer, and they tried to, send all these people from places like North Africa and Central Asia across the border of Poland, and Poland, they sort of mustered all their border forces and sent them to this area to stop it. And I ran into these sort of strange, but actually quite nice Polish Protestant people, Lutherans. They were helping refugees. They were,
both of them. No, sorry.
Well, actually, they had a church, but only one in Krakow, which is one of the biggest. And one of the guys who's a pastor, he was concerned that it was, racially motivated, because most of the people that Lukashenko into Poland were sort of dark skinned. Oh, really? And I said to him, look, I think it's important that you vet whoever comes into your country. It's one of the problems of the European Union. It's one of the reasons Brexit went through. And I mean, he didn't have much to say, but I mean, people don't move around that much. I don't think they don't travel that widely. But I mean,
I have a question for you. In your recent travels to the Baltic states and Poland and so forth, were you speaking Russian with the populace there for the most part? Because I know you're a linguist in Russian, and so I'm just curious as to whether you were comfortable speaking Russian and what the reception was, if that were the case.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I the only place that I found that Russian was perfectly okay once they knew that you didn't speak their language was Ukraine. And in Kiev, it was, it's a Russian-speaking city. I mean, it's basically Russophone. Basically, people have made an effort, and I went into a northern district of Ukraine that came under assault early last year, and the Russian forces withdrew after the siege or the assault on Kiev failed. Then those two northern provinces, they were also they retreated from there too. And up there, the guy, I mean, of course he spoke Russian, but he kept saying, gee, I'm really not used to speaking Russian. And I was surprised because they're very close to the Russian border. Of course, they're on the left bank side, so they're east of the river. And this was Chernihiv, Chernigov, as it's been known for most of its history, actually.
Right.
But other than that, I mean, in Poland, no, they don't speak Russian there. It's a very odd thing because Polish grammar is almost identical to Russian grammar, almost identical. I took a semester of Polish back in college, and it was almost identical. And then when you go up into the Baltics, Latvia was the only place where I found that Russian was was generally accepted. And if people didn't speak very good English and they found out you spoke Russian, they were relieved. Estonia, not so much. Riga was fine, but also Daugavpils, obviously. Daugavpils has a substantial Russian population as a percentage. And Vilnius, no, Vilnius, very strange. And Vilnius, I have to say, Lithuania is an odd bird. It really is. I mean, I don't know what they're doing, but they had the most Ukrainian flags out of any place I went was in Lithuania. They were completely over the top. It's everywhere. And a few pride flags as well. Not many, but I saw a couple. Yeah, I mean, Russian language, yeah, I mean, I think that is mostly a political issue. I mean, people don't want to, they don't want to be seen or overheard speaking Russian because it's not the thing right now. But the reality is, I mean, and certainly in Ukraine,
it's been the commercial language there for 1,000 years.
It's the lingua franca. It's the lingua franca. I mean, I will admit that there are parts of Ukraine where they speak Ukrainian mostly on a daily basis, but Ukrainian as a vernacular is not very old. I mean, it certainly is a written vernacular. It's probably maximum 200 years old.
My wife is a native Russian speaker, and she can understand. She gets along in Ukrainian. Okay. I mean, they're not, it's like Spanish and Italian. They can muddle through.
I can always find that I can understand the theme of a conversation. If people are speaking Ukrainian, I can watch the TV and I know what they're talking about, but I can't quite get the details. So it's enough different, and it is it's a construct. It was created in the sort of late, I guess, 18th century or early 19th. So Taras Shevchenko is their big hero. And by the way, there's a big statue to him in the center of Moscow. He was a freed serf. He was a freed serf and he worked for a Russian master and he was freed. And then he went back and he got into all sorts of trouble. And he was kind of a Renaissance man in a way. He was a musician and an artist and everything. So he's not really that controversial. But for some reason, he can't. He's never been the basis for their political nationalism. It always goes off into this, far, I guess you'd call it far right field. I'm not sure, but it's not pretty, and I don't defend it. I feel like Tim Snyder, the historian, who says, "Well, I don't defend that, but we have to." I mean, and by the way, I made the point in the article as well, which I really think is important, but I mean, maybe it's only important to me because I think kind of in a lawyerly way. I was trained as a lawyer, which is that the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in 2014 was never legally, it never achieved legal legitimacy because they never. So what they did was they chased him out of town, and admittedly, it wasn't very manly of him to flee. And he fled on a helicopter. He fled first to his mansion, which I never got a chance to visit, but it looked to me like it wasn't that bad in the scheme of things. It was like, oh, look at this mansion, it's over the top, and and there are poor people, and this guy's living in. Like, well, I mean, it wasn't that bad. It was.
They haven't seen. It's interesting to me. The Ukrainian media hasn't really shown any pictures. They haven't done a architectural digest spread on Yulia Tymoshenko's mansions, right?
Right. I mean, that's a very good point. And frankly, Poroshenko had this villa in Spain, and he got into all sorts of publicity problems for that. That was a scandal. They found out he had a villa in this, on the Spanish Riviera or whatever it was. So these, it's very hypocritical. And so, but Yanukovych left of his own volition. I don't think anyone got him out of there. I think he was savvy enough to realize, look, he looked out the window or something, whatever, and there was a mob out there, and they were going to come in, and he somehow got out. And I think that to give him credit, I don't know which route he took to get out of Bankova, to get out of there, but he flew by helicopter. He picked up a lot of stuff. Then he went to Kharkov. Then he went to Donetsk, and then he went all the way around to Crimea, and then he flew off to Rostov, where he still lives. Now, I mean, this is not a model leader, probably, but the point is the parliament, then the Supreme Rada, they get together.
He could have been Afghan,
Well, exactly. I mean, he could have been Karzai, but anyway, he soon pitched up in Russia. Putin, of course, he actually publicly expressed some kind of disgust. I don't remember what his exact words were. But then the Supreme Rada got together and they held a vote on impeachment, okay, and then ouster. Well, that vote actually got 328 votes, and they needed 338. So they were 10 votes shy, and I don't know why they didn't make sure they got them all. Maybe they could, maybe they weren't confident that they could. I have no idea. But they never did. So it actually it's never been legally sanctified. And you can say, well, what difference does it make? It was unpopular.
I know an election like that.
But exactly. But you can be sure. You can be sure that one capital that was watching all this very closely and also paying attention to the legal aspects was Moscow. I mean, Moscow's looking at all this and saying, well, that's it. I mean, they can't. They called it a coup and a putsch, and it doesn't matter what you call it. I mean, maybe it was a coup. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of conspiracy theory about CIA involvement, and it's probably perfectly valid. I don't think Oliver Stone's movie is actually bad on that, this Ukraine on Fire. It's got a lot of very valid stuff. I don't know how much of it is verifiable, but there's a lot of suspicion about what happened on the Maidan on the night of February 21st.
Right.
But anyway, the point is what happened on the night of February 21st and then into the wee hours, February 22nd, was never legally legitimized. And so, from a legal perspective, you look at it and say, well, this is basically, it's come around now. And now they're getting the idea that, yeah, okay, you took power by force, and lots of states are formed that way. Let's face it, they are. But you're not necessarily going to get to govern the whole state that was recognized as having Viktor Yanukovych as its president.
As a Soviet republic, right? Those borders are not necessarily in perpetuity.
Right. And I mean,
so let's do this. I've got a couple of folks that we have to pull out of the chat. Watcher, we've got a couple of super chats. I don't want to let them go any longer. We're going to come back here in just a minute. Durna 1804. The reason for hypernationalism in all these post-communist countries is society would cease to exist if communists were blamed for communism. You had to be a communist to be a dentist. Yeah, although party membership was never ubiquitous. But yes, your point's well taken, and that is you needed to be part of the crowd in order to go along to get along. And I think there's one from earlier. If I can ask you to, I think J-Sup had one earlier. Yep. This damn destruction, in his opinion, was a sympathy play by Zelenskyy. He knows there is a developing global Ukraine disinterest. I think it's turned into that. I think it's turned into one more plea for money from him in this regard, because he's never met. He and Rahm Emanuel are kind of the same cloth. There's never a crisis to waste, particularly if you can raise a couple of bucks while you do it. So your point's probably valid in the broader sense, but I'm not sure that he did it for that reason. He's got an offensive to fight. He's got to start somewhere. So we'll see what happens. So we're at about an hour and 14 minutes, Chad. I'd like to sort of finish consideration of this piece by sort of getting to the central question, and that is your views expressed there sort of paint a picture that the United States in particular is going to face a fish or cut bait sort of decision, with respect to what is the trajectory in Ukraine, and that depending upon what that decision is, in the face of an offensive or not an offensive or a failed offensive or just being bankrupt, that's going to have a knock-on effect in terms of our ongoing role in NATO. Now, there are many of us on this panel who would admit Ukraine tomorrow if we could get out of NATO, and I'm one of those people who feels that way. And so, but I do agree with you. I think that I think that our time at NATO has pretty much run its course. We've been the shield, we've been the sword and the shield. If you There's a little bit of a pun there on the KGB, but we've been the shield for Europe for 80 years, actually longer than that, but for almost 80 years in the context of NATO. And we've bitched about they don't make their 2%, and we've expanded NATO in contravention of the Russians' expressed warnings as it relates to that. But I think we've shot our bolt as a member of NATO. I think giving the Baltic dwarves an undated call option on our defense budget is a really bad idea. And I would hope that we could. It's light years away from where the populace and certainly the deep state is today. But I would hope that we would see our way to disengage from our commitments in NATO. I have a suggestion. I'd like us to turn our attention to the southern border, but that's a different show at a different time. But I'd like us to sort of wean ourselves or wean NATO from our defense budget, and maybe not necessarily have to spend $1 trillion a year just to go out and try to browbeat recalcitrant Europeans to do a fraction of that. I mean, we've got sheriff departments in the United States that are bigger than the Estonian army. And that's not hyperbole. It's true. And so I don't think that they get the largesse of being able to call down $1 trillion defense budget to defend themselves just because they signed a piece of paper and we thought it was a good idea to hotbox the Russians several years ago. I think we ought to get out of that discussion and move on and fix the things that are broken in this country. We've saved Europe twice in the last 100+ years. I really don't want to do it a third time, and I certainly don't want to do it for the benefit of Ukraine. They're not a worthy recipient of our blood and treasure in my perspective. So that's my read of your article, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. How do you feel about it?
Well, I mean, I generally agree with what you said. I mean, my only concern is that ironically, I think among those countries that get this largesse, like Estonia,
they're the most rabid of the bunch.
Well, they're the most rabid, but they haven't really broken any rules. So what we're looking at really is
poor policy on our part.
Right. I mean, we have to decide in our own interests. Look, okay, yeah, we made this commitment, but we do have a sovereign right, which is supposed to be, can override international treaties, and that's an act of Congress. I mean, I don't know, Congress seems really useless in the United States, but if Congress wanted to, Congress could say, we're out, now. And they could do that with any number of things, but they don't really behave like a real parliament. Our Congress doesn't behave like that. No. So what we've got is we've got these people that are afraid that, we'll lose faith. We let down the Poles, we let down the Balts, and they haven't done anything wrong. They've stayed within their borders. They haven't attacked anybody. They haven't launched any provocations, and meanwhile, it could very well be true that Putin looks at them and says, that's all a provocation. They're not actually hostile to us in their hearts. They were with us. They love us, who knows? But the point is that line in there, those intermediate states, is they will determine our international face. And I will say this, although I'm basically a non-interventionist and I don't believe in these entanglements and this perpetual war, that I do think we have one indispensable ally in Europe, and that's the UK. And I'll add that the UK, that Brexit was a result of a security liability on the part of the European Union, in my opinion, at least in part. It was all, it was all, obviously, many factors were involved. It was never popular. It was never put to a popular referendum, membership in the European Union.
Right.
But the Brits voted out, and I think, because I don't have a lot of faith in the integrity of elections, that the result was probably much more in favor of leaving than the official result suggested. And that's a theory, but it's based on experience. And so but you see, Britain is the most enthusiastic about prosecuting this war against Russia, but they are also in NATO. They also have this thing where, we're all tied together and we have to make it work. Meanwhile, the divisions within NATO, as exemplified by Brexit, are manifest. The Brits got out because they couldn't reach a deal with the French and the Germans about reforming the EU and protecting this and that. Immigration was out of hand. I mean, open borders, migrant policy that was just, and frankly, they still haven't fixed it, the British government.
No,
they're still dysfunctional, but they will fix it eventually, I think. And so we have to think about what our real interests are. And people can disagree that Britain is an inseparable ally of the United States. Many people may disagree with that. I happen to believe that it is. But that doesn't necessarily legitimize NATO. Britain can't keep us in NATO. I mean, if
no,
they
can't. And I think our relationship with NATO is or the UK is on a far different basis than many of us look fondly back at the special relationship, right? Yeah. And I'm an Anglophile. I don't recognize the country that I came to love, and I lived in London for a bit and spent a lot of time in London. I don't recognize, in many instances, what the UK has become, but I do think that that's a relationship that needs to be determined on a separate basis from the rest of the EU, which is a bunch of mad people who are off on some wicked tangent at this particular point. And so I'll agree with you on that. But I do think the longer we hang around in the Ukraine without a plan, without an end goal, without a communicated sort of objective in which to. I mean, this is like if FDR sort of got involved in World War II and said, "Well, we're just gonna stay involved until we figure out what we want to be, okay, or what we're going to do." I mean, that's the ludicrous nature of this involvement in this 1939, early 1940 parallel that we're in with Ukraine. And my big concern is that by not having a clear idea of where we want it to be, we guarantee that it's going to end up where we don't want it to be. And that's going to be catastrophic, broad, multi-nation warfare across Europe, and maybe severe military and other consequences for the United States, because this thing could spin out in a hurry.
Yeah.
Jim, any thoughts before we go on?
Yeah, I think it's just great to listen to the conversation because you guys are so deep on the human side of this Ukraine, Russia, EU piece. I know Chad's background very well, but being able to speak to what the people have been talking to him about as he moved through the region, and then as being wizened older guys, observing this and being able to have a conversation about what people are missing. And I just sense that our national security people and our strategy shops are completely oblivious to this in favor of very short-term political goals. So and that you can apply that to Middle East policy and Asian policy too. There just seems to be this gap in analysis.
There's a paucity of competence.
The Jake Sullivan world, I can't put my finger on it, but it's we're missing something here, and we keep getting pulled into these conflicts, and we're right at the cause of the conflict at every moment. I mean, you guys go back to Maidan and the early years of Ukraine. We're right there. I mean, our trained people are involved in this activism, and we always end up in a bad place stimulating activism in these countries. And post-World War II, it didn't always lead to bad things. I mean, we did fairly good things in Italy after the war. We did fairly good things in Greece after the war. But then we have this tailing activity where we really didn't do a very good job in some of these countries with our activism. And I think there's a lesson here for the United States that we should begin to think of ourselves more as a nation that kind of stands alone and has its own rules, in more of maybe a Swiss approach or a Swedish, a Swedish approach to the business of running a nation state.
Well, we've got a lot of problems in this country we need to face.
Yeah, we do.
And the first of which, in my estimation, is a lack of sovereignty on our southern border, which is manifesting itself in all sorts of adverse ways for the United States. But we don't seem to be too terribly concerned about that as a nation, and certainly not as an administration. And yet we're prepared to lecture everybody about everything, and include our little pocket card that says, by the way, you must accept our social mores as well. Otherwise, we basically have no time for you. And while our nation pulls itself apart on those very same interests, witness Glendale, California, where a bunch of Armenians decided they really didn't want trans LGBTQ grooming to be extended down to elementary school. And finally, when nobody would pay attention to them, they just started punching Antifa guys in the face, which certainly got them the attention that they wanted. And we'll see where it goes from there. So I think we're in a very precarious place as a nation. I think we got a lot of decisions to make. I don't think that the ultimate outcome of Ukraine is necessarily our highest priority, despite what you read in almost every media outlet in the United States. But I think slowly but surely, as things sort of continue the way that they are in Ukraine, I think Chad makes a very good point that says nobody can communicate, nobody can articulate what our policy goal is there. It's just more money, more arms. And we'll let you know when we think we've taken enough out of the hide of the Russians to be able to make that, to call that victory. I think part of that is the need for the Bidens to be a wartime candidate without being actually at war. But I have no confidence in their ability to walk that fine line. And I'm very concerned that we're going to get sucked into this in ways that we haven't yet. We're, as Matt says, we're not prepared to do it anyhow. We're going to dust off, some pretty old armor and get out there.
Well, look at the condition that our military is in. Just look at it. Just look at it.
I gotta say, I am so tired of seeing U.S. Navy ships rusted out.
Yeah, that's doing what I do. I encounter a lot of retired military officers from all the branches, senior NCOs, and all of my Navy contacts are absolutely beside themselves on that incident specifically. I mean, there were others. The Zoom wall was another one.
LCSs, yeah, we can go on.
The little crappy ship, yeah.
Yeah, actually, I think the greatest indictment of the Navy. And Joe, I'm glad you're back. I'd like your views on this. I think that the Bonhomme Richard burning to the keel at the quay in a naval shipyard said everything I needed to know about where the Navy is at this particular point. And the fact that I think that guy basically got a slap on the wrist that they sort of manufactured his culpability on.
Yeah, he's also of Asian descent, and we kind of swept it under the rug. And having served in the Marine Corps, not just in the Marine Corps, but as a CID attached investigator, there's more to that story that they're just not telling. And the fact that we didn't do more we weren't able to save it, and the fact that somebody was able to intentionally burn one to the keel, it really is a sad indictment.
Yeah. I'm so let's not get a war that we're not prepared to fight, and we'll go from there. All right. Any other comments around the horn? We're almost at we are at the 1:30 mark, and so we've I'm gonna scrap some of the things we were going to talk about. But anything around the keel that around the horn that we want to talk about, because I want to share with our viewers sort of our plan for the next couple of weeks as we make the move to Twitter exclusively in July.
Well, since I missed the whole show and y'all probably already talked about it, I'd like to give my 2 cents on the dam, if that's all right.
Please go ahead.
A couple of things. Number one, before people start throwing blame around, you should look at the map of the tactical situation and tell me who benefits. Second of all, it was most likely just a normal failure, but that failure was brought on by months and months of admitted shelling and rocket attacks by the Ukrainian side. I'm not trying to bang on Ukraine or cheer for Russia, but those are the facts, and they are undisputed by either party. So it's a tragedy, but it was not eco-terrorism. And if you want to lay blame on one party or the other, Ukraine took more active steps on it. I get it. If Russia hadn't invaded, none of the fighting would have happened there. But everyone seems to be forgetting that there was fighting there since 2014. The coup led by, I can't even remember what country sponsored that coup in 2014 because it's not convenient to remember. Anywho, those are my thoughts.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, guys, for your time this evening. And Chad, thank you very much for your time. You're welcome back at any time. And
Thanks.
and
Can I just make one brief opinion, very briefly?
Yeah, sure.
So, I mean, this is probably a shot in the dark. I don't really know anybody who's active in Democratic Party politics. I mean, I know some people who are sort of Democrats, but not active in the politics. And there's a bill before Congress introduced by a Republican, Arizona Republican. And the bill was introduced in January. It's HR 637 by David Schweikert of Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called, for short, I don't remember the full name, but for short, it's called the JFK Act of 2023, or the Justice for Kennedy Act. And it's an extraordinary bill. It calls for the the heads of 6 government agencies to release all documents related to the assassination of President Kennedy within 30 days of passage. Now, what's interesting about this act, of course, concerns an icon of the Democratic Party from 6 decades ago, is that not a single Democratic member of Congress has offered to co-sponsor it. And this thing was sent to 6 committees by Kevin McCarthy. And it is now before the subcommittee on the CIA, which is a subcommittee of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody knows what's going to happen to it, but without co-sponsorship, it has very little chance. Apparently, its chances of passage are about 3%. And so it might have been sent to the CIA subcommittee to die. And it's developed as a kind of cliche that if you criticize the CIA, you're some kind of left-wing conspiratorialist. I think we're way beyond that now. I think that we were talking about Ukraine. We don't know how we got involved there. We don't know what the causes were. There are many.
We do. We just don't have the time for it.
Exactly. We do, but we can't, So there are many aspects to this, but I still believe, and this is an eccentric belief, that if we can get transparency on this as much as possible, we can prevent these kinds of things from happening. Because we're talking about several unsuccessful, reckless interventions that have not gone well for the U.S. since World War II. I mean, I'm not a historian, but Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, they haven't ended very well.
We're 0-3-1 since World War II.
Well, I mean,
Korea's a tie for now.
Korea's a tie. It was a UN action and so forth. But the point is, anyway, that's kind of digressing. But if anybody anybody knows of any Democratic, anybody in the House who might be willing to sponsor this bill, because it's a bold bill, and I really admire this Republican congressman for introducing it, but nobody wants to touch it. I don't know why. It even calls on the commissioner of the IRS to release all the tax records that have been completely withheld since the 1990s when they were introduced into the collection. And this is an issue that the U.S. public as a whole is not totally, they're either they either disbelieve the official explanation that we've always been given, or they just mistrust it, or they just think that there's something wrong with it. And I tie a lot of our current day problems to that issue. And some people even believe that Tucker Carlson lost his job because he did that outrageous segment about it back in December. I'm not sure. Of course,
I think that contributed to it, no doubt.
I think it was one of the factors. And so if anybody knows anyone, I mean, I have written to lots of congressmen, of course, my own, who is a Democrat, but as far as I can tell is useless if he's listening. But I haven't gotten anything. And I'm in touch with people who are active on this, and attorneys who are suing Biden in the archives in federal court. And they're trying to do more than one thing at once,
So how much of this is the motivation for RFK's decision to run? Because I know you have some kind things to say about Robert Kennedy Jr.
Yeah,
I'd like to have you back at some point, and we'll talk about that, because I don't think he's going away anytime soon.
No, that's a very good point. I am a fan, and not just for that. I don't know the extent to which that motivated his decision to run, but he's been unshaking about it, and he's quite well informed, not only about the murder of his uncle, but the murder of his father as well. I mean, he's looked into this. He's the best informed candidate that we've ever had on this issue. Most candidates, if they think about it at all, it's just as a kind of thing, well, there's no money in it, so why should we bother? And he's been very outspoken. I don't necessarily agree with him that beyond a reasonable doubt it's been proven, or that the CIA was behind it. I think it's beyond a reasonable doubt that the CIA knows more about the accused assassin, the guy that was held responsible, than they've ever learned.
You gotta think about that guy's bravery, though. His father and his uncle were murdered by the CIA, and he comes right out and says it, and then runs for office. So, I mean, that says something about him.
Yeah,
I fully agree. And in fact, he said there are worse things than dying when people have asked him about that. Are you afraid of getting whacked? And he said, well, there are worse things than dying. I admire him. So I hope that he stays in it. I think he's splashed into a ridiculous elitist party with a super delegate system that doesn't, that is supposed to kill off any insurgency.
Well, as far as James Clyburn is concerned, it's over after the first primary in South Carolina, just like it was in 2020 when he came to Biden's rescue after Biden had lost in both Iowa and New Hampshire. They've now moved South Carolina to the front of the line, and they're going to try to spin that into there's no reason to talk about anything anymore because Joe Biden will be the candidate, and there won't be debates, and there won't be this, and there won't be that. And so I think I admire what Kennedy's doing. There's things I don't agree with him on, but I admire his willingness to speak his mind on this issue, and I really admire his stance as it relates to the whole vaccine charade.
Yeah, me too.
As far as the assassination, if I recall correctly, there's a guy in Tennessee who says he still has the shovel. So, none of you guys get that joke? Come on, that was a good one.
Yes, I got the joke.
I'm the one that made it just yesterday in reference to a contemporary classic film.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. I was there to witness it. So, all right, real quick, and then we'll let everybody get on with their evening. And I appreciate your time tonight. We are in the process of reformatting this show, I think, to a significant degree. What is important from a sort of logistics perspective is that we're going to be moving to Twitter and Twitter only in the first show of July. The rationale behind that is that I don't want to have to worry about YouTube and Rumble and we ride on the future conflict channels at this point, and they've got their own issues. We've got our own issues, I should say, as it relates to being monetized, one thing and another. I have real aspirations for where to take this, and I don't want to be looking over my shoulder at YouTube and Rumble. What I'm comfortable with or confident enough in is that if we move to Twitter, we can do what we want. We can say what we want. We're gonna draft Tucker a little bit in a NASCAR sort of way. and sort of see what happens from that perspective. But it also frees us up from a production value perspective, both in terms of music and video that we've wanted to incorporate into this, I think, to make the show more lively and one thing and another. So I'll count you down each week between now and then as to where to go as it relates to Twitter and what we're going to be doing. So just bear with us. And one of the things that we're going to be doing is people ask about the chat, and one thing, what do you do when you go to Twitter? We're probably going to do a DM chat room that will allow you to continue to chat as you currently do on YouTube. I'm less concerned about the super chats and all the rest of that sort of stuff. I'm not concerned at all about trying to monetize on YouTube or Rumble as it relates to the traditional format. We're in discussions with sponsors for the show. We'll monetize it that way. And I'll take you back to about a month or so ago. I sort of went off on a rant about my favorite topic, Mexico and fentanyl and the cartels and all that stuff, and said we were going to do something about it. And so we have drawn up the paperwork to create a 501c3 that is going to be focused on fentanyl and fentanyl only and issues. My goal is to be the tunnel for towers equivalent in the fentanyl space with that 501c3. And the commitment we're going to make to that is that the money that gets generated from sponsorship and other aspects of this show will go to that effort. We've got a lead donor. We've got the things we need to do to expedite the approval by the IRS of our 501c3 status. But stay tuned. We'll fill you in as it relates to how that's going to be progressing. My goal is that by September, October, that'll be finalized, and we'll be able to sort of speak the truth as we know it as it relates to fentanyl and all things related to the undeclared war on our southern border, both with the Mexican government and the Chinese. So that's kind of where we're headed, and we've got a schedule for the rest of the summer that I'll be publishing in about a week's time, and we'll be back, and we'll be, I think, better than ever as we continue to move forward in a Twitter universe. So that's kind of where we're headed, and thank you all this evening. Thank you all out there that are watching and or listening. Thanks everybody for being a participant in this. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, Chad. And I thank you for drawing out this point about we're going to have to fish or cut bait on Ukraine in the not too distant future. And I think that the events in and around this offensive or lack of an offensive are going to be seminal in trying to make that determination. Because I think that the monolithic sort of support for Ukraine is going to begin to sort of fracture in the longer this goes on. Now, I can't speak for the NATO guys; they're all nuts anyhow. But but I think that we've got a number of Republican candidates for president who call into question what are we doing here, and we may have a new speaker in the House at some point in the not too distant future. So we'll see where we get to. Thank you all, and Watcher, I'll ask you to take us out.